So CAUTI was probably the #1 or most acquired infection when you went into a hospital about 8 to 10 years ago. And so the CDC, Joint Commission, everyone got together and said, there's a lot of recommendations out there. Let's update all the guidelines. Then, of course, the Affordable Care Act happened, right? When facilities basically stopped being reimbursed for CAUTI. And now it actually impacts their overall reimbursement score. So a very simple product, a catheter, has now caused kind of this downward spiral of all of these expenses that hospitals are dealing with and impacts their overall reimbursement. So that's why people should care about
So
CAUTI.
how did that impact you and your company?
So I was fortunate, maybe you wouldn't agree with me, but to fall into the urology category at Medline when I started there about 11 years ago. And what we quickly identified was that the insertion of this product into the patient actually has a lot to do with them acquiring an infection or not. And although I am an engineer, like I can say this, I guess, because I am an engineer, the original device or design of the insertion tray was clearly done by an engineer. How small can we get the package? How compact can we get it? And what we found was that because of the design of the device and the packaging, people were putting these very basic products in a lot of different ways and making a lot of different mistakes and contaminating the catheter during the insertion process.
So when you say putting it in, you mean in people's bodies?
In people's bodies, yes.
Cool. Cool.
I knew, we saved the best for last,
Yeah.
clearly. So we saw this as an opportunity to take a very commoditized product and really make it into a solution for these hospitals.
And what were the steps that you went through, building awareness, building champions? I mean, just high level, what got you from there's this problem, we have this product that we can improve upon and do something neat with, and now we've got 10,000% market share? What got you from point A to point B?
Sure. So I think, we did a lot of design work around the packaging, and that's where a number of my patents reside, on how can we make the packaging and the process intuitive. And I think IBM Watson clearly stole it from us, but one of our taglines was designed by nurses for nurses, and there's nothing that resonates more with a healthcare professional than understanding that the product was really designed by them. You talk about nursing buy-in, and that's probably the most critical when you try to implement a product within a hospital or a healthcare network. They're not necessarily the decision makers, but they can make or break your success during an
Oh, no, hang on.
implementation.
Raise your hand if you've ever been scared by or just intimidated by a nurse. Right? Really? You've never been scared by a nurse? Never in your life? I don't believe him. No, nurses are hardcore.
Yeah, definitely. And they don't like change, right, which we've talked about. And so I think really that positioning of being designed and developed by them and making that message crystal clear during the marketing and the strategy and the positioning of it, and all the way down to, I'm sure everyone's familiar with in-servicing, right? Like at the bedside, actually talking to the nurses about the product they're implementing. That's the first few words out of our mouths, and I think that's really been a driver for our success, is their understanding that they were a part of the development process, and because of that, they're immediately bought into at least opening their mind to a change.
Yeah, I think it stands to reason that if the nurses are advocating for you, you've got a leg up.
Mm-hmm.
That brings me to something that came up a few times over the course of today, and we heard actually a couple of different sides of it. We've heard some marketers talk about the difficulty of getting alliances and real information and real data out of hospitals, but then we heard, from the Watson folks, I think a very informed perspective saying, yeah, try working with the government, bud. From which perspective, hospitals are not that opaque.
Right.
What's your take on that, on the relative difficulty of getting actionable insights and information out of hospitals?
Personally, my experience is people don't really want to share their data. Facilities are concerned with if the rate isn't zero or the outcome isn't ideal, they don't want that message to proliferate around their organization.
Can I do a head check with the room? Raise your hand if you've ever tried to get data or information out of a hospital. So about 8 of you? And how many of you succeeded? 3 of you. Okay. 3.5. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're not imagining things.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, and the data that's published is a year or more old, right? So it's not like you can just go on to, Healthcare Compare or whatever that, website is. You really are working with kind of, I think this facility has a problem, so I'm going to position this as a solution. And so we kind of came up with some creative ways to get around that, which the first and foremost being we offer an assessment. So because people aren't super forthcoming with what their data is, we oftentimes go in and position that we can do this kind of comprehensive assessment for the facility where we look at a number of different things and employ nurses in order to go in and get the data that we wish that we could have kind of on the front end. And so that's been very successful.
That has been. They I don't want to say they fall for that, but they fall for that.
Right, well, because then we kind of create their game plan. So everyone knows
Okay.
there's way too much work to go around within a hospital. So if you can bring any value to the table, they're very open to kind of allowing you to do the work and bringing some of the solutions to the table.
So by doing the assessment, you bring enough added value that they don't mind parting with some data.
Right, exactly.
That's very smart.
And then we can do a post-assessment, which really shows the impact that the solution we were able to bring and implement has on the organization.
Let's come back to the post-assessment. Let's go back to the decision-making process. I'm sure in this room there are 1,000 good stories about pump committees and infusion fairs and, it's going to go through the nurse committee, it's going to go through materials manager, it's going to go through the CEO, it's going to go through the decision-making process in a hospital is variable and often opaque. How do you get eyeline to that?
It's very challenging,
Yeah.
but I think a lot of organizations have gone to a very dynamic model in decision making, so it typically isn't just one person. And so continuing to ask the question, who's going to be the driver for change, who's going to actually give the approval, is helpful. And a lot of times there are committees that are kind of fostered and really ultimately positioning for them that you're going to make their lives easier, that you're going to bring the solution in and do 99% of the legwork for them, often alleviates that because everyone's talked about, right? Facilities don't like to make changes. That's a lot of extra work on them. So if you can tell the story of success of we've been able to implement this, we did all the work, it wasn't any additional, time or energy on your part, and here's the outcomes that we can drive. It kind of brings the patient and the financial piece together, which I think are really the two areas that you need to hit on when selling to a hospital organization.
Going back to what do you see as some of the underdeveloped aspects of medical marketing that we could all take back with us?
Let's see. So I think one of them being there's got to be a way that we could all work better together, right? Hospitals are looking at these problems really holistically, and every individual organization has kind of siloed solutions that maybe address 1/10 of kind of the whole issue that somebody's thinking about. So if it's falls or risk management or hospital-acquired infections, is there the ability to do more partnership? A lot of these IDNs or organizations are really open to this risk share model, which they haven't been kind of keen to in the past. And so is there a way for multiple companies to kind of join together and potentially do something a lot bigger than we're doing each individually on our own?
So you're almost envisioning a larger, more solutions-based kind of situation?
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting.
So from that extreme all the way down to the nurses, I think that is the area that we don't really target enough from a marketing perspective.
Nurses.
And because they are the change drivers within the organization, and if we're not speaking their language and getting to them directly, then the message has been sold on a top level, the CEO, the CFO of the organization, and all of a sudden all of the nurses need to just adopt the change. So how do you kind of put the two together and make sure that the message is getting there? Because at least from my experience, hospitals don't have great communication typically. So a change and a decision is made, and all of a sudden the nurses need to adapt it. So how do you really get to them and make sure the message is carried forward?
Yeah. We've been very critical. We sound very critical of hospitals, but we love hospitals. Love, love, love. No disrespect to hospitals. That's more for me.
Yeah.
You talked about coming in after for a sort of post facto evaluation. What does that look like on your end? What kind of insights are you garnering when you come back into a situation and your marketing made these pretty promises and your salespeople made these pretty promises, and now it's happened?
Right, right.
What do you learn at that point?
That they actually make a great improvement. They do a good job. I think, you know, we do the same exact assessment pre and post, so we're looking at the same data and kind of comparing it. And people really do want to make a change and impact, and so if they understand the why, we talked about that a lot today, if everyone understands why you're asking them to make these changes, there's oftentimes a lot more buy-in on that individual level, and you do see a change in their practice and their culture kind of around adopting either a new product or a new process that you're trying to implement. So I think it's typically been successful, which is great.
Do you get, in addition to being able to evaluate how your product or your solution went in, when you come in for those post facto evaluations, I'm assuming that's an opportunity for you to get even more insight into what's happening with the client and what their processes are and what their pain points are.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the relationships, we talked a lot about relationships today, and the data we're able to gather on the front end when maybe just the sales rep has been in there selling the solution, and all of a sudden you show up and are like, all right, I'm here to do an assessment. You know, that relationship is much different on the front end as it is on the back end. So typically by the time that we're doing a post-assessment, there's a whole additional level of trust with the person that you're working with. And so then all of those stories emerge on, oh, we were able to reduce our CAUTI rates, or this product had this impact on this patient, and you get that personal level kind of information. So I think people are a lot more willing to kind of give that information on the back end.
Well, anytime you deepen a relationship, people are going to open up.
Right, right. Definitely. So one of the things we do is look at the storeroom, which seems very basic, right? But you can look at the products that are available, but then you can also look where they're positioned within a storeroom. So how does that impact the nurse's behavior when they go in to grab something? Are the other alternatives closely located? Are there other things nearby? Are the kits they're using or have available to them fully stocked with all the things they need? Then we talk to clinicians and kind of get an understanding of their knowledge base, and then we also do a patient bedside check, so more of a clinical assessment. So within the clinical discovery section of that, there's a lot of other things that we kind of try to identify. Do they have tools maybe outside of the scope available to them? Are there other opportunities for cross-selling within, you know, our organization that we might be able to pull in, you know, on the back end?
I have a follow-up question to that. You talked about in the storeroom and the nurses, and that got me thinking, are biomed techs something more of a thing in the U.S., or is that still mostly like a Canadian thing, a European thing?
Depends on what you're selling. If it's capital, then the biomed is definitely an area that I think plays an impactful role in the sales process.
I was just wondering. As I'm sure everyone here knows, biomeds are technicians who specialize in medical equipment and take some of the burden of that maintenance and setup and tear down off the nurses. So they become a whole, especially for medical devices, they become a whole different layer of stakeholders whom you have to speak to with medical devices. I was just curious. They're big in Canada. I didn't know how big they were here.
Yeah, I think it depends. Like, we have some capital devices, and they're definitely influential in the sales process, because if they're struggling with downtime, or, you know, nurses are constantly frustrated with the device, their voice is oftentimes heard maybe more than a clinician on just one of the floors. And so yes, they can definitely be influential.
Any further catheter questions?
I know more than just Foley's.
What, to your mind, we've talked, and several different talks here today, about the importance of focus, right? I feel like that's an easy thing to say, it's an easy sentiment to express, it's hard to actually get done, especially when there are multiple stakeholders. you are at the tippy top of a fairly large unit. How do you get focus in your marketing materials when you have that many stakeholders?
It's a good question. I don't think it's an easy answer. You try a lot of things and see what really resonates, right? And really try to peel back anything that seems like it's not going to be impactful. I read a great book, Mastering the Complex Sale, which is really a book about selling, but it's a fantastic book that really addresses taking a very complex message and simplifying it in a way that can be easily transferable throughout multiple sales channels, so that if I tell you the message, you can turn around and tell somebody else, and that's ideally what you want within an organization where there's so many different shareholders or stakeholders, to drive change. And so we really try to kind of use that ideology and say, okay, what's the number one thing that if you were going to go to a VAP committee or one of these committees that they would really care about, and how do you simplify the message down enough in order to make it so that somebody that knows nothing about the topic could reiterate it and kind of test it that way to see if it resonates.
Are we done?
We can ask for final questions.
Final question. Final question. All right, I will ask the final question. I got to thinking about this with the Watson people, because they were talking about how people scan and their eyes glance and they just pick words out of paragraphs. And as a guy who's always been a writer, that just bit into me, because I know when you're creating marketing material, people read it like it's the Holy Torah, and they read every single word, and they go through it in this deeply specific way that it will never get read that way again.
Right.
Never. How do you account for that when you're in the brand and keep the radical difference in perspective of people who read and approve the material and read it as if it's a legal document about their children, versus the user who sees a headline, a couple of words jump out, and maybe if there's a clever bit, they get that. There's such a difference in how materials are consumed.
Right. I think it goes back to the focus and simplify, right? I mean, you might want to say a lot about something, but that's not always a good thing. So the less you can say and the more impactful it is, that's the better. So really putting it through multiple channels of people that have nothing or no idea about Foley catheters, for example, right? That's the best way to try to simplify your message so that you're not confusing the reader or giving them too much information that it can stall out their decision-making process. And so having other people kind of vet it for you that aren't as in tune or as emotionally invested in it as you are, right? That's often a good way to kind of simplify and make sure that hopefully it's being delivered kind of in multiple channels.
That's great stuff. Sarah Dickinson.
Thank you.